Hello, I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I am your host for this podcast, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Fabian Alfie as today's guest. Fabian Alfie is a professor of Italian at the University of Arizona, and his specialization is on the satiric literature of the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, so this is going to be fun. He has published on Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, and he was just elected the president of the American Boccaccio Association. His most recent book is Homoerotic Poets of the Italian Trecento, which came out earlier this year with Notre Dame University Press. Welcome, Fabian. It is a pleasure, and please tell me I pronounced Trecento correctly.
You did. Congratulations.
Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Okay, so Italian is not my area of expertise, though I know a good bit about Dante because I work on torture. And so of course Dante always comes up, and I do Chaucer, so Boccaccio always comes up. Oh my God, we got Chaucer, we got Boccaccio. That's how that works. But could you please, for the audience, kind of explain your own area of specialty and your own research?
Sure. So, Italian literature really takes off in the 1200s. The earliest of the writers tend to be influenced by the Occitanic, what we often call courtly love tradition. Fairly early on, you start seeing satiric writing. One of the earliest experts is a guy named Rustico Filippi, and it's very insulting. There's a lot of bad language, a lot of mayhem. And probably the most famous, who actually appears in this book, he makes a small appearance in my book, is Cecco Angelieri, who, among other things, wrote some nasty poems to Dante, most likely in response to nasty poems from Dante, but that's a different.
I mean, I just have to say when you say the dirty poetry, and there's what you just said, there's a lot to unpack in all of those statements. But the insults, the back and forth insults of authors with each other is like, your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries. You think of Monty Python. But they did. I mean, these satiric writers, and this is one of the things that gets me when modern authors, modern critics, modern audiences think that everything in a medieval text should be taken at face value. And it should not be.
Wow.
So please expand. I'm reminded also of the fabliau, the old French fabliau. And so the Occitan tradition, if it's influencing Italy and vice versa, I imagine the fabliau tradition, which are French dirty stories that are very explicit. Nobody makes love in the fabliau, they fuck. Let's be clear.
That's correct. Yeah, and so you see that. So, for instance, some of the earliest examples of, for instance, bad language. Well, I should correct myself. It isn't exactly bad language, but it's, for instance, references to the genitals. And you can imagine the context that shows up in. It's in this poetry that they're talking about things like, in among the poets that I translated for this latest volume, one of them, he insults his brother a lot and his mother. And one of the things he says is, to his brother, you have a mother who has tired out all the pricks in the world. And so it's one of the earliest clear references
Your
to.
mama.
Yeah, which is kind of funny. He's insulting his brother, his brother's mother.
So it's his mother too. Right? I'm sure his mother was like,
Right. And so it's on many levels, I find it fascinating. For instance, not the least of which is, this is one of the earliest examples of, bad language showing up, and they're using it. And it becomes this explosion of a lot of literature throughout the 1300s into the 14, and it really takes off in the 1400s as well, where people are just insulting one another. Often there is a serious component to the insult, and that's what's interesting, because then
is
you
why they're
can
doing
attack
it. Yeah. This is not just, I'm insulting you for shits and giggles. There's an actual kind of either social or political point to be made.
Bingo. And so that's where you can start. This is why it goes under many names, depending on which scholar you look at. I like comic or satiric. As you probably know, I mean, the theorists at the time talked about basically kind of came down to there were two genres, and they called them tragic and comic, and they're opposed to one another. This is why Dante's comedy. And what's comic is basically what's not tragic. So tragic is serious, exalted. It's a very refined language. Often it's considered Latin, but it's also the high registers of Latin. Well, comic is everything else.
So is that so okay, and this is the thing is despite all of the work I have done on Dante torture, um, I didn't know why it was called the Commedia. I mean, I assumed that it was Commedia in the sense because of course it's Commedia Divina, so divine comedy, but he didn't call it that.
He didn't call it.
He only called it the Commedia.
That's right.
And in terms of Commedia, you think, oh, the great comedy of life. But no, obviously not. Why did he call it the comedy?
Well, this is a huge topic among Dante scholars, but in a nutshell, what it is it's not tragedy. So, and they defined tragedy primarily as, for instance, the really beautiful style that Virgil used in the Aeneid. So tragedies, there's a structure, they begin well and they end poorly, right? So if you imagine a tragic
Well,
play,
like Shakespeare, well, Shakespeare's
Shakespeare.
tragedies are the death of the titular character. I
Right.
mean, the clearest designation for Shakespeare's plays are a tragedy ends in the death of the titular character, the person in the title, and as many other people as possible. A comedy is obviously ends in marriage because the opposite of death is marriage, apparently,
Right.
because they couldn't reproduce on stage, so had to make sure you could produce life, and then of course the histories. But you know that's the basic for a Shakespearean play. But in the sense of a tragedy, Virgil, I don't see Virgil's Aeneid as a tragedy, except for Dido and everybody else that Virgil that Aeneas screws over because I'm not a
Right.
fan.
If you think of Goethe's style, though, this
Okay.
is the other. So what they're doing, it comes out of Averroes, who's of course commenting on Aristotle, and this is again why Shakespeare's a good touchstone because he was versed in the Aristotelian um, theory. So what it is basically you're talking about, first of all, you have the structure. Secondly, you have an exalted style. And again, if you think of Shakespeare, it's written in a beautiful, very exalted style. But notice it's a restricted vocabulary. There are words that just aren't going to show up in Shakespeare.
Oh, because when I've studied Shakespeare, all bets are off and Shakespeare means everything. And his audiences would have been it's not really that high a style for Shakespeare because his audiences are mixed bags. They are nobility, aristocrats. They're also your commoners who could pay a penny to stand in front of the stage. And in a lot of ways, Shakespeare's not vaunted, also not original because he's stealing plots.
Right.
Language was his thing. For Shakespeare, the vaunted, sophisticated language was the sonnets. That was really his intention and how he wanted to be seen.
Right.
So the plays get very dirty, very
They
dirty.
do, but it's true euphemism.
Well, that's true. But then, of course, part of that was the politics.
Partly.
Yeah.
But you see this, for instance, if we go back to Dante's Inferno, for instance, if you recall the flatterers, they're in a big pile of shit. And he uses the word merda. And that's where you can see it's comic because this normally wouldn't show up in a tragedy.
Well, I
This
think it's hilarious that Dante gets to decide who goes where, and Dante's the one who puts people in hell or
right,
purgatory or heaven. I like you, you get to go to heaven. I don't like you, you go to hell. Fuck you, you're in hell. I mean, and this is also when we talk about the development of Italian literature, which is fascinating to me because I start in English. I
right,
also work in Norse. I also work in Irish and in Welsh and in
right.
French. And it's a lot older than what you're talking about, which is what's so interesting about it is that I never really realized that Italian literature started at the end of the 12th century. So why is that? Why is the development of Italian literature so much later compared to other European traditions?
Well, I don't have a why. It just does.
Suddenly, whew, let's do
But
this.
it's true. So it really takes off, and it's right around the start of the 1200s. It's when Emperor Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, he sets up his court. He's the Holy Roman Emperor, and he sets up his court in Palermo, and he surrounds himself with all these intellectuals. There's a huge translation, work of translation. They engage in poetry, and they translate the Occitanic Provençal courtly love tradition. They're the ones who invented the sonnet. And it just suddenly booms. And why they're writing in Italian, we don't know. But he spreads it throughout. This movement spreads throughout the peninsula. Of course, it's all the Holy Roman Empire. Um, and then it takes off. Most people then know that as the love tradition continues, for instance, outside of Florence, for a while they're doing this imitation of the Sicilian poets, that is, who were imitating or translating, we should say, the Provençal poets,
Right.
and it evolves into the Dolce Stil Nuovo, which is famous. Dante made that famous, and then it goes from there, and it then expands outwardly. What you don't see in the Sicilian poets, and that's what we call the people in the court of Frederick II. We don't see the satiric comic. There's one example only. And so clearly they're doing something ideological. My pet theory is that they were trying to position themselves, because they were primarily functionaries, they're trying to position themselves as if the inheritors of the great nobility, the legendary nobility of the Middle Ages. And so what they're doing is writing this courtly love, like we are these aristocratic lovers, just like they were.
Yeah, it's the us too. We too have this. So that to me is fascinating, and we have a hella. Um, it's fascinating because in looking at the evolution of various European literatures, because Italy is such a central part of the dissemination of Catholicism in a lot of
Mhm.
ways, and the Latin church in Latin, um, I wonder how much of that is the Holy Roman Emperor saying, yes, but then there's this whole secular side of things. And yes, you get to control the Latin stuff, but we get to control the not Latin stuff.
Yeah,
And
you hit the nail on the head, because the earliest examples of written Italian, so unlike French or something else, which starts a little earlier, the earliest example that we have of written Italian comes at the end of the 10th century. Sorry, it's around the 960s and thereabouts. And we are seeing this bifurcation between sort of officialdom and unofficialdom. And part of the officialdom is learned, educated, but also ecclesiastical. Um,
okay. And of course, you've
but
got
the
all those competing.
examples,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
okay, so if you go to Rome, it's one of the earliest examples. It isn't the earliest. It's from right after the turn of the millennium. I've forgotten the date. And it's a fresco, and it's of Saint Clement. And it's representing um, one of the miracles of Saint Clement. I've forgotten the name of the king, but he ordered his men to pull him off, to bind Saint Clement and pull him off. This is in a church, and the miracle is, instead of their ropes binding him, they've bound a column in the building, and they're pulling, but in vain. And the king, this is in the fresco, which is in the church, is saying, "Pull, you sons of bitches, pull!" And the saint is responding. So the "pull, you sons of bitches" is in Italian,
So he's saying it in Italian, and the saint is speaking.
Latin. And so you see this bifurcation very early on of, yeah, there's officialdom and unofficialdom.
And
And
then
so,
yeah, and the bad guys speak the cheap ass vernacular, and the good guys speak the vaunted official authoritative Latin.
right. And so again, going back to these poets around Frederick II, around 1200, you can see how Frederick II is wanting to establish himself and his functionaries as inheritors. We are, and spreading this among people, other nobles who maybe they don't understand Latin very well. And so, oh, but we have these songs, they're beautifully written. And by the way, it's in this tradition. They would have known the tradition as if they were these great noble aristocrats of the past, which again, and the Provençal were reaching back to the past and so forth. You can see what they're doing.
Right. Well, and of course, in the 12th century, there is this concerted effort in most European communities, and I say communities because state is a little iffy.
Exactly.
I mean, Italy's our best example of that. Not really, kind of city state, sort of, kind of ish-esque. France is not even a completely full political entity either because it has kingdoms and polities and duchies that are all, that's how you end up with Henry II owning two-thirds of France, with Eleanor of Aquitaine also being King of England. That story kills me. But it is out of the interest of kind of consolidating a sense of themselves, consolidating a sense of national, in their terms, identity. You see all of these authors giving their people a backstory, giving their people a history that goes usually all the way back to Troy. And if not to Troy, because the Irish were like, fuck you, we go back to the Bible. I mean, hold my beer. We go back to Moses. And the Lever Gavala is earlier because the Lever Gavala is 11th century, and that's the book of the takings of Ireland, the book of invasions. And teaser, we're going to talk about that on Thursday in the Tolkien class. And for those of you who don't know, I do an online Tolkien class, medievalist.net, shameless plug. So the Lever Gavala is one of the earlier ones that does this, and it's volumes and volumes of explaining the history of invasions and settlement of Ireland, but they go all the way back to Moses. Everyone else, maybe 50, 60, 70 years later, are like, Troy, we all go back to Troy. And you've got Geoffrey of Monmouth, you've got Snorri Sturluson in Iceland, who's a little later. You've got gosh, I'm trying to think. There's like a whole bunch of them. You can go throughout Europe, and they all, and to a certain extent, Dante does the same thing. He's just a little later in the uptake with that in terms of his debt and his idea of national identity.
He actually it's in Purgatory. No, I'm sorry, it's in I think now I'm getting confused whether it's Purgatory or Paradise. But he talks about women and how they would tell the family stories and they would tell stories of Troy. And so again, this and building right out of the Aeneid that the Italians were the descendants of the Trojans.
And in fairness, they have the best claim to it because of that story of Aeneas fleeing
Right.
Troy to
Right.
found Italy. I mean, that's, if you want to follow Virgil, which Dante did, like really wanted to a lot, um, then you do have that narrative. But I think what's funny about that desire to situate themselves within that specific context, because the story of Troy, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were not known to most medieval people in any way whatsoever until the 12th or 13th century. And because the Greek was not available to them. But Virgil's Aeneid, which tells that story, was. And you have the Aeneas, which is the old French. I think it's an Occitan version or it's Anglo-Norman version. I don't remember which. 12th century Aeneas, which again translates it. And so everyone's like, we're going back to Virgil. Virgil becomes their source for so much of that.
Right. And in fact, I mean, going back to those Sicilian poets, one of them, Guido delle Colonne, wrote uh, a Latin work. I don't think it's ever been translated into English, but it's called The Destruction of Troy. He rewrote the portions of those
From the
stories
Iliad, yeah.
from the Iliad and the Aeneid. Yeah. And so again, If I can put in a shameless plug for people to for people to do more translating because we need more of these translations out there. And this is one of them. In fact, not just that work, but Guido della Colonna, I don't think has ever been his poetry has never been translated into English, as far as I can tell. And he's another of those very important figures of that Sicilian school that was around Frederick II.
Well, and I mean, when you consider the variety of literatures, and now, of course, going a little bit sideways back into satire, because that's always fun.
Yes.
I mean, there is that tradition of Latinate satire with Ovid. Ovid is mocking the crap out of Augustine, Emperor Augustine, which is what got him exiled in the first place, because he mocked his sister, um, and probably got a little too close to home on some of those satirical jabs. But satire, juvenile satires, and you have the Latin tradition in antiquity of satire. So it's not like satire's a new thing. It's just something that evolves.
Yes. And in fact, let's get back to your earlier question about Dante. Why is it called the comedy? So you have a language question, everything. So when you have comedy, nothing is off out of limits. And that's why, the shit example is a good
Good
one.
to know.
There's that structure, bad to good to bad, or bad to good, sorry, in comedy. There's no language that's off limits. There's an ethical dimension. And this comes out of Averroes talking about his understanding of Aristotelian poetics, namely that there's laus and vituperium. Laus, you're praising the good. Vituperium, you are essentially insulting the less than good, the bad. And so what you see, so again, if we get into Dante's Inferno, he uses bad language. It starts badly. It's going to end well because he ends up in heaven. And he's putting people there who deserve to be, looked down upon.
And
Okay,
he's
so
doing it with a lot of very pointed
they
political commentary. But
one,
as most satire has, there's a certain plausible deniability of, well, you interpreted it that way.
yeah, no, there's no interpreting. Dante's real clear about that, such that it was one of the earliest commentators of the Divine Comedy, Guido da Pisa, who said he called it the comedy, but it could have just as easily been called the satire. And you can see, okay, there's a satiric element in Dante's, especially in the Inferno. Although when you get to Paradise, he he really gives it to the corruption of the church.
Yeah.
And he always has like the figures who represent different branches of the church insulting the corruption of their own order. So, like St. Francis criticizes the corruption of the Franciscans, St. Dominic criticizes the corruption of the Dominicans.
So
So
basically,
I
okay,
got that
so
wrong. Can you rephrase
I have
that?
not read Paradise because honestly,
No.
Purgatory bored me.
Oh,
I like Inferno. I'm really fond of Inferno because, violence, torture.
purgatory board you. You're going to need a lot of coffee to get through paradise.
That's my point. That's why I've never bothered because I'm like, you know what? I'm right there with Mark Twain, heaven for the climate, hell for the company, because Inferno is so much more interesting. Purgatorio is, I mean, and of course, the entire existence of that work itself is situated in a massively important theological question when he writes it in 1307, because purgatory is new. Purgatory was only established as doctrine in 1215 with the Fourth Lateran Council, and only as a means of justifying selling papal indulgences to get out of it, because we needed the money. So we have this scheme, but in order for us to have that scheme make sense, the thing that we are giving you a free pass out of needs to actually officially exist, because it doesn't. So before 1215, some groups have an idea of purgatory, some don't. Some conflate limbo with purgatory. Some conflate, in the apocryphal texts of Christianity, you end up with the Christian Apocrypha of the Harrowing of Hell. is that limbo outside of hell. It's the virtuous pagans. It's the people who just happen to be born before Christ. That is that inside hell, outside hell. That doctrine is not settled until 1215. And
And
even then, people disputed it because people looked at aspects of the Fourth Lateran Council and went, hey, transubstantiation, that's cannibalism. They did. I mean, that's why we have entire sects that get wiped out in the Albigensian Crusade in the early 13th century. Because the church goes doctrine and people go, I don't think so. I'm not okay with that. But so Dante's idea of purgatory is a relatively new one. And
yeah,
the important thing that a lot of people don't get is that the Christian conception of hell, purgatory, even paradise, is largely based on Dante.
of course.
Yes.
The rankings, for instance. Yeah. So what you see, and you might enjoy, for instance, he meets with St. Peter up at the very towards the end, and Peter turns bright red, and then all of heaven turns bright red. And he starts criticizing the papacy, and he says, they have made a sewer of my place. And he repeats it, my place, my place, my place, of where I spilled my blood. And Saint Calixtus, Saint was, we shed our blood not for this. And so again, it's this massive satire that shows up.
Which
And
is
that's one of the lovely things to teach. And when you teach
okay,
marriage,
that would be fascinating because on the one hand, St. Peter's assumption that it's his place versus the fact that it's a sacrifice for God rather than it's a sacrifice for Christ and that he is the rock of Christ's church, that this is not about you, St. Peter. I mean, the fact that Dante does that, but then having the founders of each of those monastic and religious orders criticizing their subsequent followers again in the early 14th century, the debate on Christian poverty was massive. This
yeah,
whole debate about whether or not Jesus owned a purse, whether or not he owned the clothes he wore. The mendicants said no. The Dominicans are like, well, maybe. I mean, what's wrong with a little bit of dosh? You need some cash so you're not a burden on society. And then you've got the Augustinians, and then you've got is it the Dominicans who had lots? Everybody had lots of money except for the Franciscans. And they're debating on whether or not they're allowed to have that money and whether or not they're allowed to have this. And for my dear viewers, if you've ever read the book, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, that book functions on 4 levels. It functions as a good medieval murder mystery. It functions as an exposition on the 14th century debates about Christian poverty and the monastic status in it. It functions as a debate criticizing the implementation of torture from the Fourth Lateran Council in interrogation and the question of individual faith and spiritualism that entails. That book, 4 different layers. I read it when I was 16 because my father said I was going to hate it. He's like, I didn't understand it, so you won't understand it. My dad let me read any book of his that I wanted as long as I put it back in the bookshelf where it belonged, because they were all arranged based on how he bought them, like when he bought them. So the books were in the order of when he bought them in the 50s. That shelf started in the basement and went up to an empty shelf in the main room. And my dad was Navy, so every time we moved, he had a list so that he could put the books back in that place. So I could borrow any mass market paperback I wanted to. I just had to put it back in the right place. And when I was 16, I wanted to read The Name of the Rose because there was a movie. I mean, 1986, there's a movie. It's really good. Baby, wee Christian Slater. Good movie, though. One of Sean Connery's medieval forays. He did so many medieval films. Someday I will write on that. But my dad said, you're not going to understand it because I didn't understand it. So you're not going to enjoy it. And I'm like, I am 16. It is now my goal in life to enjoy that book. I will enjoy it out of spite. And I actually did because I like a good murder mystery. I read it again when I was in college and grad school, and I got the debate about Christian poverty. And then as I was writing Torture and Brutality, I start every chapter with a quotation from that book about torture. So that debate, that Dante is living in the middle of that debate about all of these different monastic orders that claim to take this spiritual guidance. And I mean, the Franciscans were considered heretical for a bit. So it's not like the church couldn't agree on the color of shite. Let's just be honest. For 1,000 years, they couldn't agree on anything. And Dante's right in the middle of that. And so when he does that in Paradise, that is a particularly stinging indictment of pretty much all of those religious orders.
And that's it. And that's what makes reading the Paradiso a lot of fun. Teaching it is a lot of fun because you end up with those things of like talking about, you know, talking about the corruption. Everybody could see it in Italy in particular because everybody knew it. This was not, when you get to somebody like Martin Luther, which is what, at least 200 years after Dante's
1517, yeah.
1517 is almost 200 years after Dante's death. That's nothing new. And in some respect, Dante's kind of a precursor to Martin Luther. He's using the vernacular again, just like Martin Luther used German vernacular. He's spreading it in the technology. What Dante was doing was it looks like he was using one of the scriptorium of Can Grande della Scala, who was the Lord of Verona. He would send the little pamphlets,
the quarto versions, as Shakespeare would say.
As he wrote them, he would send them there to the Lord, and then you could write to the scriptorium, and they would make copies. And it was as if it was published in installments.
Oh wow! So like it's a serial.
Exactly. And we have this huge number of manuscripts especially the 1400s. Well, what Martin Luther does in the 1500s, now he's using the printing press, pamphlets. And, he was writing one while another one was already out in print, and it's a similar thing. Dante is in many respects a precursor to Martin Luther.
Well, I would argue even
the understanding that they're in very different periods and doing very different things.
Well, but it's not even that it's precursor to Martin Luther, because in between Dante and Martin Luther, you have John Wycliffe. You have William Tyndale. And Wycliffe would have been absolutely aware of Dante because of Chaucer. Because Chaucer, in incorporating works from Boccaccio and Dante in his own stuff in England, and that's in the late 14th century, so it's within 50 years of Dante's death. You have those ideas percolating, and they're percolating everywhere. And I mean, the old French fabliaux are an anti-fraternal satire. They also make fun of friars and mendicants and monks and church corruption. Right. So Dante is part of a much bigger satirical tradition that looks at the corruption of society and says, hang on a minute.
Right. And you can see how that ties into, just to finish, the Martin Luther thing, which is again outside of what we're talking about.
That's fine. It's really not, but that's okay. Yeah.
Italian Lutherans and the Italian early Protestants were basically saying that people like Dante were proto-Protestants, and that becomes a touchstone in especially Elizabethan and post-Elizabethan England, that here were these intellectuals, Petrarch is another one, Dante, and they were sort of pointing to sort of this Protestant. And again, we have to be careful, they're pointing out they're satirists and they're wanting reform, which is the serious end of the satire, the satirical tradition. Whether we can call them Protestants, I don't think so, but they did.
Well, and that's an interesting
get there.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, is that they're, the Protestants of Italy, like many of the Protestants in England and elsewhere on the continent, were trying to validate their own position by saying, but we're not new. This is
Exactly.
we didn't come up with this, and they didn't, because you do have the Cathars, the Albigensians, you do have the Waldensians, and like I said, the church couldn't agree on the color of shite. So some of these people, their doctrines were fine, and then they weren't fine, and then they were fine, and then they weren't, and then heretic, burn them. Or if they pay a fine, fine them, and we're torturing you to confess to, yes, you believe in a different version of the Trinity. Well, guess what? Most of the church fathers did 400 years before. I mean, this is the messy and complicated history of the variety of medieval Christianities, because there isn't just one. And Dante taps into that, I think, in a lot of respects. And in constructing his idea of particularly Inferno, with sins of the physical sins, sins of the body versus sins of the will, or this idea of gluttony and wrath, all the things that are kind of emotional responses. And then when you get into, now you've made choices, the free will aspects of those sins, where he puts so much more weight on treachery, on flattery, on on those aspects, because he experienced them. So, but I mean, wait, but with Dante being in exile
Right.
writing the Commedia in exile, basically going, I'll show you. I mean, Ovid did the same thing. Ovid is in exile and writes Metamorphoses, among
Right.
other things.
Yeah. And it is an exile, it is an exile work. Um, the one thing I would challenge you on, though, he also puts some people he loves in hell. And there's a beautiful, and this is ties into the homoeroticism. When you get to Canto 15 of Hell, he meets his teacher.
Right.
And he says, Siete voi qui, Ser Brunetto? Are you here? And it's Brunetto Latini who was his teacher, and it's among the Sodomites. And it's under this rain of fire that's hitting the Sodomites. And it's, when you read the whole canto, he's talking, he talks about him as this paternal figure, and he reaches out to him and like stretches his hand out to his face, like, but there's a rain of fire. He can't do it. It'll get burned. And it's really touching too. That's one of the ones that, I love to teach that one, because suddenly you're like, yeah, other ones, he's definitely giving it,
Right.
well, I'm putting you, you're a son of a bitch, I'm putting you in hell. And suddenly he's like, oh, are you here too? And
Which,
it's kind of heartbreaking, you
well,
know?
and it is one of those things when teaching Dante where I do have to remind my students that, sure, Dante the pilgrim feels sympathy, but
Mhm.
Dante the poet still put him there. So Dante the poet, he may have affection and may show affection, but there is still that implicit condemnation of Dante the poet, because he does the same thing with Dido. He does the same thing with Paolo and Francesca, but they're still in hell because they committed adultery. He just doesn't put them as far down as he probably should, because Dido commits suicide, so she should be in the forest of suicides, but he puts her in the second circle. Mind you, Aeneas is, it's his fault, asshole. But yeah, I'm not a fan.
Go for it. Go for it.
I'm on Dido's side there.
Totally.
The whole scene in the Aeneid where Aeneas is like, "We didn't get married," and she's like, "Yes, we did. The goddess of marriage was there." No, you misinterpreted that. We totally weren't married. I don't know what you're talking about. And then she's like, "Fine, fuck you. I'm gonna stab myself." And she defies. I mean, and her suicide is not an act of weakness. She
Oh.
defies the gods because it says her life is cut shorter than it should have been, and she does that. And the implication is that Aeneas doesn't even notice.
One of the things that I love about teaching Dante, there are people who teach him as very orthodox, very theologically sound, and they would make the argument that he's being theologically sound. He's putting these people in hell. And they're very smart people, and they're very good Dante scholars and so forth, and I give them credit.
They're
It's
allowed to do that. We're also allowed to disagree.
right. It's not what interests me. What I like are the inconsistencies and where we see the human being who composed this work. And you mentioned that, yeah, Di-
Dido,
well, Cleopatra too,
she's in there too.
farther down because of suicide. However, when you get to the island of Purgatory, if you read the entire Divine Comedy, the overseer of the entire purgatory, island of purgatory, is Cato, and he refers to his suicide. And so you're like, what are you doing here? And so it ties in with this inconsistency, or it's more, inconsistency isn't the right word, but it's more idiosyncratic.
Okay.
And so he's making himself in line with classical literature, including the writings of Cato, which is fascinating. And that's the stuff that I really sink my teeth into. But we've been talking about satire. There's an exchange of sonnets, and it's right as towards the end of the 1200s. Dante and a friend slash in-law named Forese Donati exchanged six, in total, it's three and three, insulting sonnets to one another. Now, what's important, this was actually the subject of my second monograph. What's important is that a lot of times people say Dante responded. No, he started it. This is the first one. And then Forese responds, and then Dante does it again, and Forese responds, and Dante does it again, and Forese responds. And it's fascinating to see how they're insulting one another. Because what you see is, for instance, Forese Donati, he accuses him of being a glutton. By the way, when you get to the terrace of gluttony in purgatory, who does he run into but Forese Donati again? And so it's gluttony, but also a criticism of the family. The Donati were a very powerful, noble family. And so he says, you've eaten so much that you have to take to, thieving on the streets. And when you walk by, people clutch their purses so you don't take them. And it's fascinating to see because, as we've been saying, satire ties into these bigger topics. It isn't just, oh, you're fat, and so's your mother. It's look at how corrupted the entire Donati family have. Your entire family are thieves. And what Forese responds consistently in all three of his sonnets is, oh, but you're the son of Alighiero Alighieri. And so he insults him through his father. And one of the weird things is that Dante never mentions his father. There seems to be something shameful about his father.
And we don't know what it is,
Well, they had to resort to being bankers, i.e., money lenders,
i.e., usurers.
i.e.,
Yes,
users.
which of course was forbidden for Christians. It was allowed for Jewish people because they could lend money at interest.
Right.
And for the only Christians who were given a dispensation for doing that were the Templars. And that was part of the issue with the Templars. But I didn't realize that. So his father was a banker.
A banker. Yeah.
Hmm.
And we have those receipts, by the way, so we know,
Literally.
and not just his father, but his uncle. Yeah, there's nothing that in Dante's scholarship that people aren't, it's got Dante's name on it. So,
Yeah, right. We know.
yeah,
Um,
or his father or his uncle or things like that. But it's fascinating to see because what we get back to this question of what is a nobleman in the context of these communes,
right.
which ties into the Dolce Stil Nuovo, which ties into the love tradition, which ties into, what does it mean to be a nobleman in these cities now? The cities are growing, they're booming, the economy is growing, and it needs to be capitalized. Therefore, they need bankers. So you
And
can't
so
get
you
rid
can't,
of it
yeah,
either.
you can't prohibit them from doing it. And how do you allow that within the Christian schematic of you're not allowed to do that? Well,
Right.
and also this question of shifting, I mean, social mobility in the 14th century is a major issue throughout Europe because this question of people who have money but don't have title, and so you can buy into it. Chaucer's the perfect example of that. His father's a vintner. He sells wine. When Chaucer is 7, he is put into the royal household as a page, and in the Countess of Ulster, a woman's household. And he rises through the ranks in service, but it's noble service. It's intended to train a knight. And then he's a soldier in some of the battles of the Hundred Years' War. I'm not sure he was ever actually knighted, but he works his way in through government position. He marries a woman who is nobility, who is his wife is nobility, and he is appointed the tax collector for the city of London. So he lives over London Bridge for a while, and that's the only bridge into London, collecting the taxes for the crown. And his lifetime, he dies, we think, in 1400, but 85 years later, his great grandson is in direct line for the English throne.
Ooh.
Yeah. And so within that 85-year span of Chaucer's death, and actually arguably in Chaucer's lifetime, you have that clear exposition of social mobility was absolutely possible. So for Italian city-states where you've got money and you don't have an upper level nobility, what defines a noble?
Exactly. So, for instance, Dante's good friend, if you've read the Vita Nuova, he says his first friend was Guido Cavalcanti. Guido Cavalcanti is famous for being one of the poets of the Dolce Stil Nuovo. Ezra Pound, whom I don't like because he was a fascist,
Fair.
famously translated Guido Cavalcanti's poetry. The Cavalcanti were very wealthy. They could hire up to eight, they employed up to 80 men at arms to protect their building, their palace. And but they were not noble. They were merchants, and everybody knew they were merchants. They have not a drop of noble blood in them. And that's one of the things where I mentioned earlier the law said magnates couldn't be, and that was why, because you're like, what exactly is a noble?
Right.
Is it is it by descent, and you'd have very poor nobility, or is it by marriage? Or is it, what do you do with the people like the Cavalcanti who have lots of money and they have their own private army, but they don't have a drop of blood in them,
You let
no.
them buy a title and make one up, which is what happens in a lot of places. And but you do see that in correspondence with the courtly love tradition and courtly literature tradition of southern France, because it's like, well, we've got all of these ideals, and courtly love, it wasn't, I mean, as an idea, as a concept, was largely invented by two women, invented by Eleanor of Aquitaine and Marie de Champagne, her daughter by Louis Capet, who said, well, we need a much better way of doing this because the martial culture of knighthood wasn't so nice. And you have a lot of, sure, male fellowships, but you don't have an awful lot of, let's recognize the finer parts of life that don't involve killing people. And so they foment this idea of courtly society, but they also are patrons of poets and scholars and musicians and troubadours. And the troubadours move. So when you get the Occitan and the Provençal, troubadours are moving. That's the whole point. So of course they get to Italy. And then of course they influence some of the development of that vernacular literature.
Exactly. And so when we get to the 1300s, like I mentioned, Guido Cavalcanti, he is very versed in Provençal literature. And so what he's doing, that's how he kind of does a renovation of Italian, renovation, that's not the right word, but a renewal.
A
That's
rehabilitation?
a much better word. But a renewal of Italian literature by going back to the original Provençal poets
Okay.
and doing his own version on it and then elaborating on it. He's a very interesting writer, who, by the way, one of he wrote one of the few pastorelles in the Italian tradition, and it ends with her saying, it's as if he's a nobleman, and you can see again this debate, this discussion of what does it mean to be a nobleman or
Right.
not.
Is it
And
behavior? Is it birth? Is it money? What is it?
so he's going along, he meets this shepherdess, but he's struck by love. She too is struck by love, and then she takes him behind a bush and she initiates sex with him. Now, yeah, go figure. Now, there's an interesting, and I find this fascinating, uh, uh,
Trajectory?
coda to this. One of his in-laws writes an insulting poem to him, and he says, Guido, when you had written shepherdess, I wish you had mentioned I written actually beautiful shepherd, because I hear that there was a young man and he had blonde curls and a short little tunic and a beautiful shepherd's crook, which of course we know what.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah, yeah. By shepherd's crook, we mean penis.
And so suddenly there's this, and again, we want to focus on the sexual notion of this, the
Right.
sexual, um, and it shows up a lot. But what we're really seeing, again, at least in part, is you're taking the attitude of a nobleman, and if you've read Pastourelle, and this is terribly ugly, there's very often a rape involved because
Usually.
it's usually the power differential. There's male,
Yep.
female, noble, non-noble, and then love throws that, a wrench into the works there to see how it's going to play out. He didn't initiate sex, she initiated sex with him. You see how it flips it.
Right.
So again, and of course, it's by his in-law who was a full-blooded nobleman.
And
So
of
you
course, and that
continue
and that criticism, well, and this kind of also is a nice segue into your most recent book.
exactly.
And I mean, when we talk about sexual identity and sexuality in the Middle Ages, a lot of modern audiences like to impose their modern prejudices on these. And it's very important to understand that, particularly even as the church was concerned, sodomy generally just referred to non-procreative sex. Sodomy was any kind of sex that didn't produce a child. And it could be sex between men and women that didn't produce a child. Oral, anal, manual, vaginal, just no kids involved. And it could be same sex. But the assumption that medieval societies criticize same-sex desire is not 100% correct. And
Exactly.
this is an important point.
Exactly. And you hit the nail on the head. A lot of thinkers, it goes back to Peter Damian, who wrote the Liber Gomorianus, and he really theorizes, and then what sodomy is. And as you mentioned, it's everything that's non-procreative. You forgot a couple of categories, if you don't mind me saying.
Right.
Intercrural, which is between the thighs,
Oh, okay. All right, fair enough.
and solitary.
Oh, well, okay, that I was when I said manual, that can of
Oh,
course be
sorry.
on your own. Manual can does not need to involve two
Right.
people having hands. It can be masturbatory. Yes.
And so, for instance, I mentioned earlier Brunetto Latini. There, it's really important that we go. We don't really know what Dante intended when he gets to this circle of sodomites,
Right.
because Brunetto Latini, most of the men at the time, unless they ended up taking orders, they were married. So it's hard to talk about orientation because we think, well, if they had kids, what do we make of that?
Well, I mean,
And
just because a man occasionally has sex with a woman does not mean he also does not have sex with another man,
and
or that his preference isn't male sex.
or let me add further. Brunetto Latini is Canto 15, Canto 16. Dante meets a group of other sodomites, and one of them says, it's because of my, and the word he uses, fiera moglie, so ferocious wife, that I'm here. Depending on which of the early Dante commentators you read, it could be that he, for instance, Boccaccio wrote, well, his wife basically was kind of a shrewish woman, and so he abandoned her and he went off and ran off with the men. Okay. But Dante's own son, Jacopo, said, no, she wanted to try new things in the bedroom and got him interested. And this is what this ferociousness was. And so, therefore, you're running the gamut. It could be sexuality with other men, which, sure, could be sexuality with her. And what do we make of this fiera moglie, ferocious wife?
Right. And if
And
it's she has a ferocious appetite and, introduced him to stuff that then led to other stuff that
you
involved
get it.
sodomy because it was non-procreative stuff. Um, and this is actually a very important thing, even as I've been delving far deeper in some ways in early Christian texts than I want to. God, I'm so tired of synods. I've been writing the courses for the great courses of medieval Christianities, all of those bloody synods. That's why I can say with authority the church couldn't agree on the color of shade. But the exposition against sexuality is about sex, period. It's not really who you were having it with. It
Right.
was, we would really rather you just didn't. And the people writing it were people who weren't. And in fact, many of those people also had wives for a while. I mean, the prohibition against priests marrying, again, isn't until Fourth Lateran Council. And just
Right.
because the church says don't do it doesn't mean they didn't do it.
And so what I came up with was um, this translation of these poets. So
Right.
they are primarily coming out of that satiric tradition. This is what makes it difficult because they're using, I mentioned earlier Cecco Angelieri, who had written the nasty poetry to Dante. They are definitely in his shadow. One of them probably knew Cecco Angelieri. He's really the first. His name was Meo de Tolomei. Both of them were from the city of Siena. They influenced one another, he and Cecco Angelieri. And Meo de Tolomei has this corpus of about 20 poems. They're all insulting. So they're all in that Lausat vituperium. So it's all insult. And among this corpus, there are about 5 sonnets. He criticizes what it's an ex-lover named Ciampolino. So little John Paul, John Polino, Ciampolino. Um, and he basically says, you have abandoned me, you're treating me badly, da 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 da. But I can go to the taverns just like you, and this is his expression, I can desire the masculine just like you do. And so it's very clear these were ex-lovers. Then we get to the 1330s, and unfortunately, all these people have very similar names. Um, so there's a manuscript from Perugia. So it's about 90 kilometers east from Siena. It's they were writing in the 1330s. There isn't much of a literary tradition in Perugia at this time, but it's another commune. It's one of the hilltop communes. And fortunately, we have this one manuscript that preserves their poetry, and it's in Perugian dialect. That's what makes it a little difficult. And one of them is named Cecco Nuccoli. So another Cecco. Cecco, by the way, was just a diminutive from Francesco. So
Okay. Little
um,
Frank. So
little
basically,
Frank,
little Frank.
little Frank. And his are very
Frankie.
distinctively, almost exclusively, his poetry is about other men. Some of it is very distinctively courtly love. So he refers to, for instance, a man named Trebaldino, and he says, I'm dearly in love with the letter T because it's the start of this beautiful name. And if you were to just change the gender of it, it could be any one of 1,000 courtly love poems, except it's for this Trebaldino. Um, and so a number of them are as if they're just courtly love, but for a man. Sometimes he refers to him as signore, so my lord. Okay, so again, getting into that whole courtly tradition of they're above me in station, they're above me morally, and so forth. The Provençal writers used mi danse, right? So my lord even for the woman. Well, he's doing it for this signora, and we don't know if he's referring to the same Trebaldino or somebody else. It's not specific enough. So some of it's in that tradition, but some of it's very comic and it's elusive. It can be insulting. And so this is what makes it hard. It's like, well, is there bona fide yearning here? Is it true attraction? Is it comic? Is this other stuff parodic? Um, there's a lot to untangle here.
Right.
There's another Perugian poet named, and again, I'm sorry, but we had Cecco Nuccoli and we have Marino Ceccoli.
Okay.
So you could see, oh,
Yeah, right.
but he too is doing very similar things. So he and Cecco influenced each other. We don't know which one came first. And he too is writing. Some of it falls into this. It's very similar. He writes about, oh my Lord, I want to serve you, but you do not take pity on me. Again, what we would expect as this courtly love, except that he's talking about a man. And some of it is more comic as well. So we end up with this comic tradition. We also have references to Cecco Angelieri, the Sienese writer. We have references to Maio de Tolomei, so the one who is talking about Ciampolino. In fact, Cecco Nuccoli also says, I can go to the tavern and and gamble and drink and hang out with Ciampolino. And you're like, whoa, the name is showing up.
Hang on a second. Yeah.
And so then, so there's a lot of untangling that we need. And what do we make of this? The fact that it is love poetry, sometimes comic, sometimes not. It's for other men. We do know that at least, so Mayo de Tolomei, the first one that I mentioned, who was in Siena, the Tolomei were an extremely powerful banking family in Siena. So he would have been part of the nobility. The ones in Perugia, they were of the lower nobility and they were notaries.
Okay.
So what it looks like is, and you already alluded to it, it isn't so much the sex, but because they're of the upper classes, they can kind of get away with it.
Right. And that they can, well, and also the get away with it implies that somebody would have tried to stop them. And there's no reason to assume that they would have. There's no, I mean, who's gonna complain? Who's gonna give them shit? And it depends on how widely these texts circulate. I mean, when you look at a genre like the Old French Fablio, the one taboo it doesn't cross is actual sex between men. They don't, I mean, they allude to the possibility, and the comedy is usually in avoiding the accidental homosexual encounter. And I say that, very firmly tongue in cheek because of the Fablio. Um, because you have a lot of cross-dressing narratives where a man dresses as a woman because he's having sex with a woman and he's trying to get away with it. But a man is inadvertently drawn to that woman. And, there are all kinds of discussions about whether that's trans identity. And I would argue that in those circumstances, it's absolutely not. It is cross-dressing for subterfuge. It's cross-dressing as a means of getting away with something and hiding your actual gender identity to get away with something, usually sex, and usually sex in a heterosexual sexual context. Fablio alludes to the possibility of same-sex intercourse, but never actually does it, because that's Fablio. It never quite, it never crosses the boundary. It touches it, it pushes it, and I'm using that on purpose, but it never goes, whoop, off we go, because the Fablio doesn't do that.
This does. So,
And,
for instance,
yes.
Niccoli talks about one, and we have allusions to oral sex, which are unusual. So, fellatio.
Yeah.
He says, "Well, come on over here, and I'll kiss you on the beak." And well, clearly that's a euphemism. You know,
I mean, his nose. He's just gonna kiss the tip of his nose.
there's another one where he talks about, actually, I think it's somebody who writes to him and says, your Trebaldino was bitten on the nose by a snake and was, had the venom. And it's like, something's going on here.
Somebody needs to get to a doctor fast.
There are also allusions to anal sex going on. So I mean, this is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
There is stuff going on here. And again, I mentioned the first one, Mayo de Tolomei, talking about desire, the masculine. Very clearly, the masculine isn't just male person, but the masculine organ. It's a desire for the penis. And so, therefore, it's pretty clear that these are people who are talking about sexual behaviors with men. Now, I'm a literary scholar, but I've had to look at a number of the historians of sexuality. And what you see in Italy, It's better studied as we get into the 1400s, but even in the 1300s, it's applicable. And it starts with the historian Michael Roque, a book called Forbidden Friendships from about 30 years ago. And what you see is they have these really, you have kind of a split in the consciousness. A lot of people going up to the 1700s were saying that it was very common to go to Italy and men were having sexual contact, usually with younger men.
Yes.
It was a very common practice. It
So
was
in
not
and it, so in Forbidden Friendships, you see a discussion
the Rogies.
of men going to Italy
Right.
and people recognizing that there are same-sex relationships, usually in older men. That follows in many ways the Socratic model, because
Exactly.
Socrates and the Greek philosophers were noted for the the idea that women existed to give birth. And you might be married, but your true relationship was that with other men. And your sexual desires might be much more effectively channeled to younger men, where you would cultivate and teach them. And I have a lot of friends actually in the gay community who, when they recognized their sexual identity when they were teenagers, they sought mentorship, sexual mentorship and relationships with older men. And that was because that was how you did it.
Well, what we see in a number of the historians of sexuality is, in fact, a continuation of they call it the Mediterranean, where it's younger men with older men, and there are
Yeah.
a lot of, but it seems to have been extremely common. And I say that because what you see is this split in consciousness. So we have a number of for instance, the communes are enacting really harsh laws with really harsh penalties. You mentioned the play with the red hot poker. Well,
Yeah,
that
that's
is one of the common punishments that
is
you
it.
now. But what they start looking at is if you look at the punishments, it's horrendous and so forth. And then how often were these enacted? Not very.
Right.
And so what you see is kind of a code of silence going on, like, oh, yes, yes, we've got to enact these laws.
But who's going to enforce them? I mean, but that has been time immemorial. That's been the issue with sodomy laws forever. It was the issue with sodomy laws in this country. I mean, in the state of Virginia, when I lived in Virginia, anything but procreative missionary position heterosexual sex was illegal. But who the fuck is going to police that? The thing is that somebody did, and somebody invariably somebody decided to be an asshole and police it and have somebody arrested for it at some point in time, and because the law existed they could get away with that.
Right.
But I would also hasten to add that in a lot of this younger men older men dynamic, we are talking young men in their teens. We're not talking children. This is not pedophilia. This is because that was not allowed.
And that's what you see, at least from the scholarship I've read. This is what you're seeing as well. It's
It's
younger,
teenage,
older.
it's post-pubescent, it's 15,
Exactly.
16-year-old. These are young men who might be having sex with people of their own age otherwise in other circumstances. It's not it's not pedophilia. It's consensual. And that's the other aspect of it that's very important. And Catherine Harvey has written a brilliant book called The Fires of Lust. And
Yeah, I
Catherine,
just read it.
I think one of the best interviews I had was Catherine Harvey, because she and I did this and she was on the podcast. And then I did I'm like, well, here's all the stuff we didn't talk about medieval sex. So I had medieval sex part 2. Um, the assumption that this would have been considered deviant, and I put that in massive quote marks, that it would have been considered a problem. It wasn't. And medieval societies were far less intolerant of relationships as long as they were consensual and as long as they didn't breach the social order.
That's it. It's the breaching of the social order that is important. And so again, going back to, for instance, Mayo de Tolomei being of the aristocracy. Okay, but this is keeping the social order. Or, the poets in Perugia, well, they were notaries. So again, they're part of the aristocracy. So the social order is maintained, and they probably were married. Mayo de Tolomei was. So they're continuing their line.
And as long as his wife doesn't mind, then why do we care? I mean, it's like the whole culture of the courtesan in Venice, that you have this, that you and the courtesans were educated, they were knowledgeable, they participated in the political life of Venice as courtesans in a way that their wives were not allowed. And if you've ever seen the movie Dangerous Beauty, it's
Oh
called
yeah.
The Honest Courtesan in Europe. That argument that the wives are like, that's not fair. What teach us, because we want to know what we want to know. And part of it, what you see is that imposition of modern sensibilities, modern prejudices, modern prudishness. America is so fucking prudish that we have a tendency to look at anything not that and go, oh my gosh, look at what they were doing.
You
Most
see.
Europeans are like, yeah, and
Well, or we could, but let's not forget the Victorians were also like clutching their pearls left and right.
oh
I mean,
yeah. I mean, okay, so let's be clear. America and England, like the I mean, and the Italians and the French make fun of the prudishness of the English all the time, which is funny because then if you consider English satire like Benny Hill and stuff like that, it's all usually sexual humor. It's like we really don't allow that. American audiences are like, nope, nope. But part of what makes the work you're doing so important is because, of course, your most recent book is an edition,
it's a
correct?
decent translation.
Right. And so the need for edition translations, my colleague David Rollo, who I say my colleague, he is a French scholar, and
Okay.
he is a colleague. He's in Southern California, USC. He
Okay.
just published a book. Okay, so I have know of him, so I won't say my colleague. Probably not the way to put it. He's apparently a lovely guy. He's a colleague of one of my board members for Explorations of Medieval Culture at Brill, and he just published with us an edition of Alain Delille's Complaint of Nature as sex between men, and an edition and translation of the Complaint de Nature and sex between men. It's the title of the book. Let me tell you, the title of the book is Sex Between Men, and everyone's like, and I'm like, yeah, 100%. But it's an edition. And having editions and updated editions and translations is really important. Can you kind of explain why in your process for doing
Yes.
that with your book?
Well, it's really important. I mean, I mentioned I came to this from the satiric tradition, and these guys, there is a satiric element in these, and I found myself wondering, how come nobody's translated these guys? And finally, I was like, well, I guess I'm doing it. Um, and we need so much more. I mentioned earlier, the poets of the Sicilian school. I mentioned, we need so much uh, more better translations, or sometimes just translations at all. In medieval scholarship, as we need translations. I mean,
Right.
everybody was influencing everybody else, and these linguistic divisions that follow the modern day map. There isn't an Italian that then the French. I mean, it just would have blended into one another. And so we need these translations, and we need better editions. A lot of editions haven't been updated since the 19th century.
And part of it, of course, is the accessibility of text. So for the
Oh,
audience
yeah.
yeah. And so as the audience may or may not realize, that when we talk about an edition, we're talking about somebody who has transcribed what is in a manuscript into printed form and makes emendations and corrections depending on the state of the manuscript. They actually write out verbatim what they think is in the manuscript, and then they have glosses for what they think the possibilities of what different words mean. My
Exactly.
dissertation was an edition.
Oh,
My
yeah.
dissertation was an edition and translation of Middle English. So I did the female saints of the Guilty Legenda, and I did a full transcription of Middle English manuscripts, copying out exactly what I saw and then interpreting the different possibilities. And then my first book was, in fact, a translation. So my
Right.
first book was a translation of these lives into modern English, the female saints. So I
Right.
understand that process, and a lot of people don't. But if you don't have an accessible edition and you don't have access to the manuscript, you're screwed. We can't work on the text. And not, even though there's a huge mass amount of manuscripts that have been digitized, that's not all of them. And even then, sure, you can digitize. But if you can't actually read the paleography, which is the handwriting, you are also screwed.
Exactly. Exactly. And I mean, you know, exactly. We need good editions of this stuff and better editions of what's been done. So a lot of, Italy was unified politically in 1861, and there was a whole lot of, find our roots in the Middle Ages. So there's a whole lot of editions, manuscript work. I mean, these guys were worked on at that time and were discovered at that time. Okay, great. But a lot of the way we understand them, the way we read these manuscripts, new manuscript discoveries, we need better, newer editions of it. And then, um, you know, for scholarship, we need the translations because I mentioned these guys are in Perugian dialect. Even for somebody who speaks Italian like me, that's a struggle because it's not standard Italian. And see, one of the reasons, and this leads to why I wanted to do this translation. So I started off looking at the Boccaccio and some of the other like Dante and so forth. And what's interesting, so when, again, going back to the reading the historians of sexuality, the general idea is one of them called it kind of a universal bisexuality, which I can see how they get there. But you end up with somebody like the main character of the story I just mentioned. That sounds to me like an orientation. He is not having sex with his wife. He's having sex with men.
Right.
And there are several other texts where you see that in the Italian tradition. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this translation is to try and get more studies of right now, there's still a lot of work to be done.
This kind of leads me to an important question with everything that you do. What do you think modern society can learn from the research that you do and from the texts that you study? What can modern society take away from this? What
Well,
should it take away from it?
first and foremost, nothing new under the sun. I mean, this is not new. This isn't, people writing about it. Um, there's a tendency to want to say like, this didn't happen in the past, or if it did, they were, they were thrown out the window bodily.
Right? By an aged king. No problem. The virile Edward the
It's not
First.
like the guy couldn't have gone.
Right? Don't think so. Right?
So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the first and most. I think we need much more scholarship and much more study of these phenomena. Um, if you've read, for instance, I mean, the history of sexuality, again, I'm not a historian, but as I understand it, it really takes off with Michel Foucault. Well, Michel Foucault has a multi-volume series. Yeah, you know where I'm going. He's not good with medieval sexuality.
He's not good with medieval anything. Let's be clear.
No, in fact, he kind
Discipline.
of jumps over it and he's like, there's the classical world, and then 1,000 years happen, and then we get to the early modern
The
period.
Dark Ages. Well, I mean, and Michel Foucault is the one who, with Discipline and Punish, the argument about the use of torture, the argument about prisons, the development of the prison system. Because, yeah, he's got the volumes on sexuality, but then he's also got Discipline and Punish. And that's where my worlds intersect, is these two things. And Discipline and Punish, what he says about the Middle Ages is bullshit. It's
Oh, yeah?
100% rubbish. Well, this idea, and it gets with Johann Huizinga, the waning of the Middle Ages. Oh gosh, there were gibbets in every town, and that gets promoted by Barbara Tuchman in the calamitous 14th century, a lot of which was about Italy, by the way. They're violently torturing people and murdering people, and brutality people would have experienced this day to day. Bullshit.
Right.
Rubbish. And Foucault, looking back at the development of the prison system, skips over the Middle Ages pretty much. He makes a few comments here and there, but what he has to say is so not applicable to the development of anything before the 17th century.
Right. And again, that sort of notion of universal bisexuality, that comes out of Foucault. Again, I can see how they get there, because of the ways that sodomy are undefined. But as I mentioned, like with that Boccaccio story, well, but we do have references to people who really sound like they have an orientation.
Right. That
To me, doesn't sound like universal bisexuality. That seems like
right.
some people are non-functional unless they're with their people of their own gender.
Right.
Well, that's interesting. And we need people to study that, to get just better information. That's another thing that I'm hoping will come out of this, is that people will read this or other things like it and start going, okay, yeah, we need more work on it. Again, there's a place for people who study, for instance, subtext. Absolutely. That's important too. Here we've got text.
Right. Now we don't need to interpret it. We know exactly
You
what
don't
it
need
is.
to interpret it. He's like, I'm going to suck on your beak. Oh my.
Right. Well, and I mean, in the context, particularly in the American context, where in so many ways the current discourse regarding sexual identity, regarding sexuality, regarding trans identity is one to say, that's invented, that's not real, that's not a thing. And yet, there are various shades of interpreting that in medieval texts. There are various ways of saying, yes, it is a thing, but there are also places where it's not. Not every instance of cross-dressing is an instance of trans identity, but that's not to deny trans identity doesn't exist, because of course it does. Same thing with, as you say, it's not always universal bisexuality. There's some people who preferred only, could not perform without their own gender.
So, can I refer to, we've been talking about male sex. Um,
Women had sex with women too.
Yeah. Before I get into that, when this came out, I was joking with Brenda. I was like, "Did you know men had sex with men and they enjoyed it?" It's like, it's much harder to find references to women having sex with women as of yet. So we need more people climbing through the historical documents. Italy, in particular, has really good archives. The communal archives go back. The oldest is Bologna, but they go back to the 1200s. Now, granted, you have to be careful because a lot of it is things like legal, right? So that's going to
Yeah.
skew what you're finding. But it was Carol Lansing, the historian, and the chapter is called Donna con Donna, and then there's a colon. I don't remember the rest of the colon. But she found a reference to a woman. Her name was Guercia in Bologna. I think the year was 1295, and she was accused of sodomy. So again, there's that word.
Yes,
Um,
I know this story.
Having sex with, I think the number was 12 other women. But it's in Latin. I believe the word was virilia. So something that is masculine like, that she was using an implement.
Yes.
You see where I'm going with this.
Oh, yes.
So you can assume it was some sort of sex toy, dildo, something along those lines. Now, when I read about this, at first you go, okay, this is lesbianism, and quite likely so, plausibly so. However, my next question was, what about those 12 women? And so what's going on here? And if she is the one with the implement, then are we getting into gender inversion?
And there's the possibility of that in that legal text, because Catherine Harvey covers that legal text with the idea that the woman with the implement may not have presented as female to those other women. She may have presented as male. And then we get into the case in England of Eleanor Reichert, who is a woman in dress, but is biologically male. And of course, her court case, it says that she had sex with both men and with women, that she had sex with men as a woman and she had sex with women as a man. But it also says that she lived as a woman, that she actually, for 3 months at
Mhm.
least, was living with another woman as a woman, and that is identity. That is genuine, lived trans identity.
Right. And even the laws as they were written about sodomy were things like men taking the role of the woman. Even if we were to go back to the Old Testament, men lying with another man as a woman, what exactly are we talking about here?
And because when people want to say that the Bible condemns homosexuality, it doesn't. What it says is liars of men, and liars of men, specifically in the Greek, has multiple meanings. I know I have consulted biblical scholars about this. And the language itself, liars of men, it doesn't even say liars of men with other men. It just says liars of men. What does that mean in the word itself? It depends on how you translate it.
Yeah.
And it's considering that if we are talking about the Christian Vulgate, it was a collection of texts handed over to a certain Jerome, who himself was noted for having a bit of a profligate youth, and
Oh,
oh yeah, oh yeah, no,
I'm
Jerome.
aware.
Oh yeah, I mean, Jerome went to the point where out of penance he would sit in the catacombs in Rome to scare the crap out of himself to try as penance for all of his lascivious behavior. This is the guy who decided how to translate the Septuagint from the Greek into Latin. Go back to the Hebrew text, because the Septuagint he felt had been corrupted. So he had Hebrew, he had Greek, more or less. Ish esque on the Aramaic, but he's translating for sense. He tells us he's translating for sense. He says he's not translating literally. So if you want to take what he says about liars with men as, well, I guess as gospel, then you got to consider the process that went through. And a lot of that is Jerome, who had an issue with women, and yet many of his patrons were women. And he gets accused of having an inappropriate relationship with Paula, who he later elevates as a saint. And that's actually what ends up getting him booted out of Rome, is the implication that he and Paula are more than just spiritual advisor.
So can I add a
Please go ahead.
parenthetical comment? So we started off by talking about satires. He has one of the most important satires, is one of the most influential satires, which is his Adversus Jovinianum, which was, it's horribly misogynistic, okay? And you find rewritings of it throughout the Middle Ages and beyond.
As a justification for more misogyny. Yes.
But what's important and what's often forgotten was there's a purpose for that, which is he was trying to reinforce monastic celibacy.
Yes.
A better way to do it than saying, well, why would you want, it was Jovinianus who wanted to leave the brotherhood and get married. And so, well, why would you want to get married to one of those horrible beings? And he goes on and on. And what's important about that is it's easy to get focused on, and it is misogynistic. I mean, there's no denying that, but it's for a purpose. And what is that purpose? And you see that over and over with the satire. I've published a bit on some of the late medieval and early Renaissance misogyny. And again, you see that it's like, but it's about the love poetry, love tradition now, instead of marriage, which is what he's talking about.
Right. Well,
Um,
and in his particular case, because he'd had such a youth, as it were, and he right. I mean, it's kind of like Origen, who mistranslate, or he doesn't mistranslate. He too literally interprets the passage in Matthew that says, "Make yourself a eunuch for heaven," and he has himself castrated. I
right.
mean, Jerome has taken it too far. Let's be honest, he's taken it too far. Because at that time, monastic celibacy was not a given. It was not even doctrine, and it wouldn't be doctrine for centuries. And, you have the question of monastic celibacy versus then priestly celibacy, which are two different things. And like I said, priests aren't forbidden from marrying until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And in some ways, the Fablio are a response to that. It's like, well, if you don't let us have our own wife, we'll have everybody else's. And that is what they do in the Fablio, because there's always a monk or a priest, shagging somebody else's wife. To understand that context and to understand that human beings wrote these texts,
Right.
human beings bring to the table their own interpretation, their own biases, their own background. Jerome, absolutely 100%. And yet, because he wrote the Bible, the interpretation that he puts into it is then inflected as that text is translated and transmitted. And in the modern Christian prohibitions about sexual identity, they are taking stuff literally that they probably shouldn't. So, on that note, Fabian, thank you so much. This has
You're very
been a
welcome. This was a
wonderful
lot of fun.
conversation. We have covered an awful lot of ground. It has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for this.
Anytime, anytime. So if you want to talk again, let me know because
We absolutely have more to
I
talk
could talk
about.
about this for days.
Absolutely. And I am Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.